Good afternoon, being that we are now by the holiday of Pesach. So we are going to be discussing the holiday of Pesach and the concepts of how we can learn from the holiday of Pesach and the miracles of Pesach and what that has to do with our life. And what we're going to glean it from is from a story which is discussed in the Haggadah. Of course, as we know that everything in our life and everything that happens around us is not by coincidence and is by divine providence, and as Baal Shem Tov tells us, that that a person has to know that whatever happens in the world and whatever happening above is because of our behavior and our action. And therefore, when we see world events happening around us, this is telling us that this is something to do with what's going on with our times. And we look back into the stories of the Torah and to the miracles that are happening, and we look to see how we can reflect from it and learn from it and to continue to become stronger because of it. And as many of us woke up on Sunday morning to a morning of miracles, where the miracles that happened to the Jewish people was something which was unbelievable, unusual, unprecedented, where while we looked back 7 months ago, on Simchas Torah on October 7th, was an unprecedented attack against the Jewish people, at least in comparison to the population of the Jewish population in the land of Israel, as well as looking at what happened on Saturday night, on 6th of Nisan, the amount of missiles and projectiles that were aimed with one mission and one directive only to, God forbid, hurt and destroy as many people as possible. And the great miracle that happened because of it was also unprecedented. And we have to, as a people, and especially as the Jewish people, recognize the miracle and thank God for the miracles that have happened and to see these great miracles. What gave us the ability to enjoy and to see and to merit such miracles, as now we're in the month of Nisan. The month of Nisan has a nun before the name of the month and a nun at the end, which tells us it's Nisei Nisin, great miracles, double terminology of miracles. So we're in a month of miracles. And this miracle is something which is, as we live in this month of miracles, we were able to experience and see these wondrous miracles and amazing miracles unfold in front of our eyes. And we always have to look and see what is the lesson that we can learn from these miracles? What is the lesson that this teaches us? And if we look a little deeper, one can actually say and acknowledge and say that these miracles are maybe not something that just happened now on this past Saturday night, but actually the miracle started 7 months earlier. That the miracle began on the night of October 7th, when the Jewish people didn't capitulate. The Jewish people didn't fold their arms and say, they attacked us, let's just pack our bags and goodbye. But God forbid. We were resilient, we stood together, and that's what taught us that we should be able to be prepared and ready to experience these type of miracles that happened 7 months later. This is the story of the Jewish people. The story of the Jewish people is about resilience. The story of the Jewish people is that for the past 3,000 years we have become experts of how to respond and how to be able to grow from any tragic event that happens to us. Not, God forbid, to capitulate, not, God forbid, to give up, not, God forbid, to say that it's over, doom and gloom, but on the contrary, we're able to embrace every single type of event that happened to the Jewish people and utilize it as momentum for growth to be able to become better and stronger. And as we, the Jewish people, unite together, recognizing the pain, the suffering that we endured 7 months ago, this gave us the ability and the strength to recognize that we need to be united, we need to be strong, and we need to remember that to be able to be decisive and recognize the difference between good versus evil and recognize for what it is. This is the unique character. If we look on the Seder plate, there's one item on the Seder plate which symbolizes the character of the Jewish people, which is the egg. The egg on the Seder plate, the hard-boiled egg, which is there for 2 reasons. Number one, it symbolizes the sacrifice, the holiday offering that was brought every single holiday So on Pesach, there were two types of offerings that were brought, two types of sacrifices. There was a Paschal offering, which was specific for Pesach. That was brought on the 14th day in the afternoon. But then on every single holiday, whatever it was, there was a special called Korban Chagiga, a special holiday sacrifice, and that's symbolized by the egg. That's one reason for the egg. The egg also symbolizes the cycle of life, but the cycle of the Jewish people. While every other thing, the more you cook it, the softer it becomes. Like take any vegetable, a carrot is very hard. You cook it, the more you cook it, it becomes softer. The egg is just the opposite. The more you cook it, the more it's under fire, the harder it becomes. The Jewish people are symbolic of the egg. That the more we are put under fire, the more heat we get, the stronger and tougher and more resilient we become. They say a story that just, going around was one of these stories about a fellow by the name of, he doesn't give his name, but he was a fellow that was down in the dumps, if we want to call it. He was a person who was he was a druggie himself and selling drugs and addicted to drugs, and very bad situation, if you want to call it. A few weeks ago, or a few months ago, like right after October 7th, he walked into a rehab and he says, I want to get clean. I have to change. I want to get better. They asked him what happened. He says, well, there's a fellow who was a general, or I don't know exact terminology of how you call it in the army, but he was a high up there, colonel in the army, and he was killed in Be'eri, and on the 7th of October, and he's the one, and in his merit, I want to get better. People thought that this guy, probably this colonel, saved his life, and that's why, as in gratitude, he wants to come and get better. So he says, no, he didn't save my life then on October 7th, but he saved my life today, that's why I'm here today. He says, what do you mean? But he was killed. He says, me and him were neighbors. We grew up together in school. We went to school together. He rose in the ranks in the Israeli army, made it to a very high rank. And meanwhile, I was, if you want to call it, on the lowest rung of the ladder, down in the dumps, addicted to all different kinds of drugs, selling drugs and everything else that you can imagine. Just a few months ago, he came over to me and he tells me, I know that things are not all right by you. I know that your life is not okay. As much as you make it sound like you're happy and everything is good and you're making money, you're selling all this type of stuff and you're having this jolly good life, I know that life for you is tumultuous. You're down in the dumps, things are not working out. Check into rehab, do yourself a favor, change your life around. I looked at him when he told me that, as if he fell off the moon. What's he telling me? But all of a sudden, October 7th happened, and I knew he was saying the truth, and that's why I'm here today, to change my life around. He didn't save my life October 7th, but he saved my life today. Every time any person goes through some type of tragic moment in life, it is a wake-up call to ask, what did I learn from here? How did I experience this? How did I become stronger because of it? What did this do in my life that I became better because of it? And as we're going to look at the story of the Jewish people of Passover, but not only is the story of the Jewish people of Passover, but even more so how we celebrate the story of Passover. How we talk about the Haggadah and the stories that are mentioned in Haggadah will give us a better insight into this exact idea that the Jewish people's resilience and how we become greater and stronger because of the things that happen in our life. And as it happens in the macro, in the greater part of the Jewish people's lives, it also has to do with the micro in every single person's individual, because every single Jewish person embodies the entire Jewish nation. We all have our own Exodus and we all have our own Egypt as well. And to understand this, we're going to talk about and explore a fascinating story which is mentioned in the Haggadah. A story which is mentioned right at the onset when we begin the Haggadah, right after the 4 questions are asked. A story that the Haggadah tells us as a way to understand and appreciate what the mitzvah is to be able to say the story of the Exodus of Egypt. The story takes us back about 5 great scholars who were sitting together and exploring and studying and talking about the Exodus of Egypt. And there are many questions that we're going to talk about. Why are these scholars sitting together? Why are they not with their families in their hometown? It's the day when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, which we'll get to in a moment, became the leader of the Jewish people. And what were they discussing? What was their agenda? Why do we mention Exodus of Egypt at night? You can think that there's so much troubling the Jewish people right after the destruction of the temple. But what was actually bothering them? A question of why do we say the Exodus of Egypt? Why do we mention it at night? The answer that we'll see and we'll explore is that the Jewish people, as they're suffering right after the destruction of the Holy Temple, the Romans were trying to build Alia Capitolina, take the place that was the Holy Temple, and make it their capital of their idolatry on the Temple Mount. And the Jewish people are asking, how can we celebrate Exodus of Egypt in such misery, in such destruction? The 10 greatest scholars of the Jewish people were tortured and killed and murdered by the Romans. Thousands of Jews were killed by the Romans, and we should sit and celebrate freedom from Exodus that happened 1,100 years earlier. The rabbis were discussing, how is it? And where did they turn to? Who did they go to? Was Rabbi Akiva, who was the one to comfort the Jewish people. He was the one to explain to them why, even in the darkest of times, we can still talk about the Exodus of Egypt. This is where Rabbi Akiva comes along, and that's why they were sitting together. So let's take a deep dive into that story, learn and what we can see from that story, and explain of how that can relate to us in today's day and age. So as we go into the Haggadah, as we know, has 15 different steps, starting with Kadesh, making the Kiddush, washing our hands, dipping the onion in the salt water, breaking the middle matzah in half and putting away for the afikoman. And then the biggest chunk of the actual Seder is called Magid. Magid, which means tell the story of the Exodus of Egypt. As our sages tell us, one who expounds into the story of the Exodus of Egypt, he is merited. He should be praised. And as we see, we go through quite a few pages, talking about from the beginning. That means from the time when Jacob met his uncle Laban, who tried to kill him. Jacob having his sons, they come down to Egypt, the torturous times that the Jewish peoples went through in Egypt, until finally the redemption and all the different parts, and finally we get to the next stage where we eat the matzah. But if we look at the story of the Haggadah tells us, no matter how bright you are, no matter how smart you are, no matter how special you are, you still have an obligation to tell the story of the Exodus of Egypt. Not only that, the more you talk about the story, the greater and the more praised you are. In order for the Haggadah to actualize and bring it to show how important it is, the Haggadah tells us a story. And the Haggadah tells us a story about Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon. 5 of probably the most prominent sages of the Jewish people at that time. Where were they? They were gathered together, studying and explaining the Haggadah in the city of Bnei Barak. All night they sat and they were studying the Haggadah. Until it came the morning that their students had to come and tell them, it's time to say Shema, it's time to put your books away, let's go and close up the Seder. Now we're talking about over here not your regular individuals. Who are these 5 great scholars? This was the generation right after the destruction of the temple, as we mentioned. Rabbi Elazar ben Hurkinus, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya were the greatest students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who he was the one that saved, if you want to call the Torah, after the destruction of the second temple. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the leader of the Sanhedrin. Rabbi Akiva was the leader of his generation. And Rabbi Tarfon were all friends of Rabbi Akiva as well. Where were they sitting? They were all sitting together in the Bnei Barak by Rabbi Akiva's home. Why does the Haggadah feel the need to mention their names? So one interpretation is to tell us as well, is it wants to stress 2 points over here. A, that they were expounding and talking about the Haggadah, about the story of the Exodus of Egypt. And not only that, each one of these people, one was a Kohen, one was a Levi, one was a convert, one was an Israelite, and no matter what status they were at, they all were there talking about the Exodus of Egypt. They all together were studying about the Exodus of Egypt. That means it doesn't make a difference of your greatness, of your quality, of life, of your ancestry. You have an obligation to study and talk about the story of the Exodus of Egypt. Even more so, the order that it puts, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, it comes to tell us that those days they would sit like on a couch, around the table. The greater person would sit in the center. The next great person would be to his right, the next person to his left, and the further right, further left. So the Haggadah tells us how they were situated to tell us as great they were, and they were sitting around this table. They were all together discussing the story of the Exodus of Egypt. No matter who you were, even Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the greatest leader of all of them, were still sitting there together. Now, who was the star of the time? Who was the star of the show? Was Rabbi Elazar. He was the one in the center. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he was the leader of the Sanhedrin at the time. However, who was the host? It was in Bnei Barak. The host was Rabbi Akiva. He's only mentioned number 4. Why is he mentioned number 4? Someone to explain is because he was a student of some of the people that were there. So the leader of the Sanhedrin was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in the center. If you want to call it, he's the mainstay of the show. And Rabbi Akiva is the host. There's a Haggadah that was written by a great rabbi in the 18th century. And he talks about and analyzes this. And he wants to know why was it that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, why was he in Bnei Barak? Why was he by Rabbi Akiva's home? He didn't live there. He actually lived quite a distance. And according to Jewish law, we know that the Torah tells us, Haggadah Levincha, that on Passover is a time for you to be with your family as you have to say the story to your child. Why wasn't he with his family? Even more so, Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus, who was also one of the people that were there, he's the first one that's mentioned that was sitting amongst the people of Bnei Barak. The Talmud says something very fascinating, that once a student, Rabbi Eloi, came to visit him, and Rabbi Eloi came to visit him on the holiday, and he asked him, what are you doing here? Why aren't you together with your family at home? In fact, he told him, he says, I give much praise to those people that are lazy and stay home with their family. What does that mean, lazy and stay home with their family? The Talmud explains, goes on to say that even if the whole reason why you're staying home is because you're lazy, you don't want to travel or whatever it may be, but you're home with your family, that in itself I give praiseworthy for, because the Torah says v'samachta, and you should rejoice with your family. You have an obligation to be with your family on the holidays, and therefore it's very important that you're on the holiday. At the same time, the Talmud asks a question. Isn't there an obligation to go to see your teacher on the holiday as well? As we find in the story of Elisha, if you recall, when the story of when the woman that was blessed to have a child, the Isha Shunamis, and she comes back and she sees that her son is not alive, and she tells her husband, I'm taking the horse and we're going to the prophet to speak to him. And her husband asks him, why are you going to the prophet? It's not a holiday today. It's not Rosh Chodesh. Why are you going to the prophet? That means on a holiday and on a day of Rosh Chodesh, it was an obligation. People did go to their teacher, did go to the rabbi. And this was actually something even until today that people go on the day of a holiday, that they go to their Rebbe, they go to their teacher to visit their teacher on the day of the holiday. And this is called Oile Regel. They go up on the holiday, that on the holiday in temple times they used to go to the Holy Temple, and now that there's no Holy Temple, they would go visit their teacher. So the question is, why is Rabbi Elazar, who he himself says that you should be spending time with your family on the holiday, he lived in Lud, which is quite some distance from Bnei Barak. And he is sitting by Rabbi Akiva in Bnei Barak. Make up your mind. If you're supposed to be with your family, what are you doing in Bnei Barak by Rabbi Akiva? You should be spending time with your family. So therefore there are some that answer, that Bar Benel, who is a Spanish commentator, answers. And he says that Bnei Barak doesn't necessarily mean the city of Bnei Barak. It means, the word Barak means enlightenment, that all the people sitting together was such great wisdom of Torah that was coming from them. So therefore, he calls it Bnei Barak. It was people of great enlightenment, people of great Torah scholarly works, but not necessarily were they sitting in the city of Bnei Barak. Most commentators say that doesn't work out, because the Talmud says clearly that the children of Haman were studying Torah in Bnei Barak. Meaning that Haman made such a turnaround, so to speak, that it was such a victory to Haman that not only did the Jewish people wipe him out in the time of Purim, but from his descendants they were studying Torah in Bnei Barak, which was Rabbi Akiva, who was a convert that came initially from the children of Haman. So therefore we mean that it was actually the city of Bnei Barak. It wasn't a theoretical or metaphorical term, but it's actually the city of Bnei Barak that they were sitting and studying. And the question is then, why is it that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was the biggest proponent of staying home with your family and spending the holiday with your family, was not with his family, but was sitting around with 5 other Torah scholars expounding on the teachings of the Haggadah? And what about the other 4 Torah scholars? Why weren't they with their family? Why was it so necessary for them to stay in Bnei Barak, by Rabbi Akiva's home, and talk about the holiday of Passover? Even more so, they should have, if anything, been by the Sanhedrin, by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's home. But they came to Rabbi Akiva's home. Why are they coming to Rabbi Akiva's home in Bnei Barak to talk about it? If you look a little bit further in the Haggadah, the next story, the next paragraph, tells us about what they were talking about. And you want to hear the important conference that the 5 greatest scholars were talking about? Is the leader, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, gets up and he says, this is what I have a question. My question to you is as follows, my dear rabbis. And he says, I am about 70 years old. These are the words. I am like 70 years old. And I haven't merited, and I don't understand why we say and talk about the exodus of Egypt at night. Until Ben Zoma came along, and he explained to me, and he says, because it says, Yemei Chayecha, the terminology in the verse, the days refers to, the word Yemei Chayecha refers to days, Kol Yemei Chayecha, all the days of your life, refers to the nights. Our sages tell us, Yemei Chayecha, the days means the current days, Kol Yemei Chayecha means even the time of the coming of Mashiach. Now what's going on over here? What is their discussion? What does Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah not understand? So if you look at the Shema, you'll see the Shema is made up of 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is V'ahavta, about love of God. The second paragraph is V'hayim Shemaya, is about following the commandments and again continuing our relationship with Hashem. Those 2 paragraphs are from the book of Deuteronomy. And then the last paragraph is about tzitzis. And at the end of the paragraph of tzitzis, it tells us, and you will look at your tzitzis, you'll remember the commandments, and you will remember also, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am God who took you out of Egypt. Initially, they only used to say the first 2 paragraphs by the night Shema. Why? Because the 3rd paragraph is about tzitzis. At night is not an obligation to talk about tzitzis. So therefore, they didn't mention the 3rd paragraph of the Shema at night. So there was only 2 paragraphs of the Shema at night. The question that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had for them was that he wanted that they should start saying the Shema, the 3rd paragraph, at night. And he couldn't figure out why I should be able to do it. I want that there should be the law, but I need to have some grounding. I need to have some basis for it. And Ben Zoma came along and gave him a verse of where you can do it. What was the debate here? Why didn't he want to do it initially? What did he need? And why does he say, I'm like 70 years old? And the commentaries say something fascinating that happened. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was actually 18 years old at the time. And the story that is told, that we see in the Talmud that happened, that at that time, up until that time, after the destruction of the temple, after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, the leader of the Sanhedrin was Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne. The Sanhedrin was moved. One of the requests that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked of Vaspian when he met him and he was able to sneak out of Jerusalem was to move the Sanhedrin to Yavne, and they should be safe and they shouldn't be hurt, and like this the oral tradition can continue. Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne became the head of the Sanhedrin, but he was a very rigid individual. That means he was concerned at that time there was a lot of negative influences that were coming up amongst the Jewish people, meaning there were people who were not sincere in their studies. They were just some of them were making a mockery, some of them were not thoroughly sincere, they may have been in other beliefs, and therefore he decided he's going to make a clean house. And if you're not sincere, and if you don't pass his litmus test, that's it, you're out. Not only that, he was a leader with an iron fist. If you didn't follow the law the way he said it, even though he had the authority to do it, he would call you to the table no matter who you were. To the extent that there was an episode that happened between him and Rabbi Yeshua, that one time Rabbi Yeshua had one calculation of when Rosh Chodesh should be, the 1st of Tishrei, And Rabbi Gamliel had a different calculation. Now, Rabbi Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, so it had to follow him. Whether Rabbi Yeshua's astronomical correct was it correct or incorrect, it didn't matter. This is one of the things, just as a side note, after the giving of the Torah, and you can see this by every holiday in the terminology that we use in the prayers, is that the Jewish people determine what day is the holiday. So the Sanhedrin, whether it's correct astronomically or not, it doesn't matter. Rabbi Gamliel determined what day was Rosh Hashanah. That meant that 10 days later was Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yeshua disagreed. He said, I'm a scholar as well. I have the astronomical qualifications of seeing it. And he disagreed with Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel felt that this was a sort of rebellion, even though Rabbi Yeshua was a great man as well. And he decreed on Rabbi Yeshua that he traveled to him on the day that Rabbi Yeshua considered his Yom Kippur, which was the 11th day, according to Rabbi Gamliel, and with his money belt, with a stick, showing that he is showing his allegiance to Rabbi Gamliel. So he was a very, very tough character, to the extent that because of his rigidness, because of his tough discipline that he had, the population of the yeshiva was greatly diminished. Because not everybody was passing the test. People couldn't stand up to his toughness, and the rest of the yeshiva, the rest of the Sanhedrin felt that this would be more of a disservice for the Jewish people, because we're now living in a time right after the destruction of the temple, and yes, we need to weed out the things that aren't good, but at the same time, we still have to have more of an open-minded attitude, and more of a welcoming attitude that people should not become disenchanted with the Torah. And because of that, they laid off and they fired Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne. They needed a new leader of the Sanhedrin. And they came to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had great qualifications. He was, number one, an unbelievable scholar, but even more so, he was a direct descendant from Ezra. Ezra was the one who led the Jewish people after the second to build the second temple. So he had that leadership within his blood, and therefore they felt that he would be the perfect candidate to lead the Sanhedrin. The only problem was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was very young. He was 18 years old. So he asked his wife, do you think I qualify? And his wife tells him, and I guess that's the only one that was going to give him an honest opinion, said, do you think they're going to listen to a young whippersnapper get up there and say, this is the law? Nobody's going to listen to you. And he went to sleep in doubt if he should accept this position. Does he have? He may have the scholarly ability, aptitude, but he doesn't have maybe the leadership ability. He went to sleep and he woke up in the morning and he had 18 strands of white hair that came in his beard. He felt that this was a sign of heaven to rethink the position, and ultimately he took the position. He took the position right before Pesach. So this episode of the 5 scholars getting together was at the time where Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is the hero of the day, comes in to save, so to speak, the oral law, the oral tradition. He again opens up the doors, and the floodgates of students are coming back into the synagogue. They're all coming to study again. And now the question over here is, what's going to happen? What's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's question? So over here, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, and this is his issue. And again, look at what we're dealing with. We're dealing with in a time where the Jewish people, we want to call it probably an all-time low. The level of sacrifices that the Jewish people had to go through. The 10 great scholars who were killed, murdered, and tortured. The thousands of Jews that were killed, floods of blood, just going down the streets of Jerusalem with the amount of people that were killed in the destruction of the temple. The Temple Mount is plowed with no remnants anymore of the Holy Temple. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, standing with all the great scholars. And what's his question? What's his issue? Not how are we going to rebuild Judaism. What's his issue? Is he's asking? Do we say the Shema? Can we institute to say this last third paragraph, the mentioning of Exodus at night? Why is that on his mind? Why is that bothering him? What was he really asking of the sages? What was he really asking of these 5 scholars? That they had to get together in the home of Rabbi Akiva and say, on the day that he becomes the hero of the day, the leader of the Sanhedrin, and what's his issue? Why do we say, I need help, show me, give me proof that we can say the Exodus of Egypt at night? And Ben Zoma comes along, saves the day, gives them a verse, and they do it. And there are many people that talk about this, and one of them that talk about it as well is the Rebbe's father, He gives it from a mystical perspective as well, and he gives it from this type of explanation. And he says over here, what was really the discussion that the Jewish people, the sages, were having at the time. The sages were getting together in the middle of the night. In the middle of the night, on the first night of Pesach, where they have to discuss and celebrate the exodus of Egypt. At the same time, in the background, not only in the background, but in their bones, they're feeling the pain and the suffering that they're enduring from the Romans at the time. They're talking about their feeling of what's going on. They're seeing the Holy Temple in ruins. They're seeing Foxen walking out of a place which used to be the Holy Temple. They're seeing the temple, how it's destroyed. Where do they come to? They come to the home of Rabbi Akiva. Why the home of Rabbi Akiva? And I don't know if you remember, we spoke about Rabbi Akiva was an individual who Rabbi Akiva was able to see the positive in every single thing that God did. From when the young time in his life when he was walking and he saw the water dripping on the rock, he knew that that was a lesson that he can study Torah. To the episode when everything was stolen from him when he was teaching and he said everything that God does is for the good. To the moment he is walking with the sages and they see Foxen coming out of the Holy Temple and he smiles and he says, I remember the prophecy that of Zechariah that the temple is going to be rebuilt. If this prophecy came true, then this prophecy is going to come true. And what did the sages tell him? Akiva, you comforted us. Akiva, you brought us comfort. Akiva, Rabbi Akiva was a person who brought comfort to the Jewish people. Rabbi Akiva was a person who, when he saw an episode that God did, instead of feeling ruined and destroyed, he became strengthened, emboldened, and comforted. He was a person who saw in every step of the way that God does not let go of the Jewish people. God is continuing to watch and guard and protect the Jewish people in every single step of the way. Where God cries out to the Jewish people, I will return to you, return and I will return to you. This was the person that the sages gathered to. Why did they leave their home? They came to the home of Rabbi Akiva to be able to see and to glean from him positivity and joy and say, how do we move on? How do we march forward in this darkness? How do we mention Exodus of Egypt in that night? Meaning, how can we pass this darkness? How can we sit while we're pain and suffering and talk about a freedom that the Jewish people celebrated thousands of years ago? We're suffering now. We're in pain. How do we talk about an Exodus of Egypt? Who's the best person to tell them? Who's the best person to show light how we can go beyond this? Was Rabbi Akiva. How did he do it? How did Rabbi Akiva do it? Rabbi Akiva continues to tell them. And this is when we take the leader of the Sanhedrin, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, reminds them. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah stands up and says, my first point of order as leader of the Sanhedrin is to be able to make it a halachic obligation that we add another chapter into the Shema. The other chapter into the Shema is to talk about the Exodus of Egypt. When are we going to talk about the Exodus of Egypt? At night. The sages look at him, but why? How? The verse talks about the time of the coming of Moshiach. Not necessarily at night. How is it anything relevant to today? Today we're suffering. What does the leader of the Sanhedrin come along and say? In your darkest of times, in the most difficult of times, that's where you'll see the light. That's where you'll experience freedom. Freedom comes from the most darkest of times. The Rebbe's father, a person who was killed by the communists, lived through the horrors of World War I, World War II, was saving people through typhus. A person who saw how the Tsar fell and communism came. He was forced and tried, at least the communists tried to force him to make him matzahs that were subpar, not according to Jewish law, and he stood up against all these odds. A person who recognized what darkness is at its best, suffering at its best, lost his entire family, he himself was killed. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, of the Rebbe's father, said as follows, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah stood up and he used the terminology, I am like 70 years old. Every single Jew becomes as old as 70. Meaning, from the hardships and the difficulties that endure upon us in this exile, we become old. And the question is, how can we talk about freedom in a time of exile, in a time of suffering, especially in this exile where the world's against us? There's nowhere for us to go, seemingly. How can we remember the exodus of Egypt on the Seder Pesach? How can we sit reclining to the left like people of freedom? Ben Zayma comes along. Ben Zayma, the name Ben Zayma, the word comes from azimut. That means he takes a deep thought. He says, you can't just look at things at the surface. You got to look deeper. And he says, even while you're in exile, even while you're going through the darkest time in your life, even while all the hardships and all the odds seem against you, you have to remember the exodus of Egypt. Telling every single one of us, we have all dark times in our life. Let's not all of a sudden say, that's it, it's dark, and we become frozen or locked into that confine of Egypt and that difficult trouble that we may have. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was reminding the Jewish people then of his time. This was in 1927. 1927. He was telling them then, it's dark, it's difficult, but we remember even in the darkest of times the exodus of Egypt. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the leader of the people. If you take the word Nasi in Hebrew, which means leader, is an acronym for the word Nitzoy Shel Yaakov Avinu. He was a spark of Jacob, our forefather. If you recall, each one of the forefathers made one of the prayers. Abraham made the morning prayer. Isaac made the afternoon prayer. Jacob made the evening prayer. Why the evening prayer? Telling us that Jacob is reminding us that even at night, we have to pray that even at night when it's dark and it looks like there's nowhere for us to go, it's dark, it's tough. Even there we pray. Even there we find a glimmer of hope. Even there we see the qualifications and the ability that we can get out of it, and that's what makes us stronger. And if you look throughout the Seder, that's the entire theme throughout the whole Seder table. Take every item that you have on the Seder table, they have a certain dichotomy in it. Let's start with the matzah, for example. The matzah, why do we eat the matzah? So the Haggadah says we eat the matzah because this is the matzah that the Jewish people had while they were escaping out of Egypt. There was not enough time for it to rise, and therefore we eat the matzah. That's one of the reasons we eat the matzah. But I don't know if you recall, right when we start the Haggadah, what do we say about the matzah? Hey, lachmanya, here's the bread of affliction. So 1 second, is this bread of celebration or is this bread of affliction? Not only that, when we say the Haggadah, we break the matzah in half, because we want to be like a poor person. That this matzah, well, they say when matzah only has flour and water, we are suffering, we have pain. It reminds us of the pain of suffering that we had nothing to have. No flavorings to the matzah. We can't even put salt on our matzah, because we have to remember the bread of affliction. So on one hand, the matzah is bread of celebration, but on the other hand, the matzah is bread of affliction. Which one is it? How do we have the same food that at the same time tells us we are celebrating, but at the same time we're also talking about suffering? Then we go to the next food. What was the next main item that we have during the Seder? Is the 4 cups of wine. What are the 4 cups of wine symbolic of? The 4 terms of redemption that are mentioned in the book of Exodus. I will take you out, and I will bring you, and I will take you, and I will redeem you. That's one reason of why we have the 4 cups of wine. But then if you look in Code of Jewish law, what color should your wine be? It should be red. Why should it be red? To remind you of the blood that Pharaoh bathed in, the blood of the Jewish children. On one hand, the wine is reminding you of the beautiful redemption that God's taking the Jewish people out. But at the same time, it's reminding you of the suffering, the pain that the Jewish people went through. The blood that Pharaoh bathed in of the Jewish people. Again, this dichotomy. What is the wine? Am I celebrating or am I talking about suffering? Take another one of the items on the Seder plate. The charosas. The charosas, the Talmud tells us, is It reminds us of, what the main ingredient in the charosas is? Apples. The apples remind us that the women, that when they would give birth in Egypt, was without any pain and suffering, and the terminology that the verse uses is tachasat tapuach, under the apple tree, I've been there with you. That's one reason. On the other hand, what's the charosas for? It looks like the cement mixture, that the Jewish people were making cement, that they had to make bricks while they were in Egypt. So again, we have the dichotomy. On one hand, it's reminding us of the slavery and the bitterness that the Jewish people went through, and at the same time, it's reminding us of the celebrations and the redemption that they had. And if we look at all these questions, this dichotomy is simply explained by what we mentioned before. That by going back to what Moshe complained to God. Moshe looks at the Jewish people, and he comes to Pharaoh. He sees them suffering, and he comes to Pharaoh, and he tells Pharaoh, let my people go. What does Pharaoh do? Not only am I not going to let them go, the very fact that you can even think of vacation means that you're lazy. I'm going to make the work even harder. Moshe comes out to Pharaoh and comes out to God and says, God, why'd you send me? Ever since I've gone here, things have gotten worse. What does God tell him? Okay, now you watch now. Pharaoh's going to let the Jewish people go and the great miracles are going to happen. But he didn't answer Moshe's question. Moshe had a question, why are you doing this to the people? Why are the Jewish people suffering? Don't send me. It's gotten worse. It didn't get better. God doesn't answer. God says, now Pharaoh's going to let them go. Where's the answer to Moshe's question? So if you look in the Torah on the words that the Jews complained to Pharaoh, after Pharaoh says, now you're going to have to get straw, you're going to have to make your own cement and your own bricks, what does the Jewish people say? Why are you doing this to your people, to your slaves? In the Torah, there are cantillations under every word. And there are some cantillations that are very common, and some cantillations that are almost not so common. One of them is called Mercha Chvula, that underneath there's like a little bow that it goes, two of them. Instead of one, but it's a double cantillation. The commentaries, the Rebbe explains, according to the mystics, this teaches us. There's a double message that they were actually saying. They are saying, Lama sasa koi lavadecha, why are you doing like this, but now they recognized a whole new idea. The Jewish people came to recognize something very unbelievable. They realized that now the exile is no longer going to be 400 years. They realized that from here onward things are going to get easier. Even though it seems like it's getting darker, but within this hardship, it's going to be harder, but it's going to get easier. That means they saw within the darkness the glimmer of light of the redemption. Because now there were only 87 years of intense labor instead of the 400 years. It was reduced to the 210 years, as we learn in the Haggadah, God that He recognized and He recalibrated. That means within the darkest of times, they all of a sudden came to recognize and appreciate the dark times, because that brought them to the redemptive times. When we eat the matzah is telling us a duality. The matzah is telling us, yes, it's the pain and the suffering that we had, the matzah. It's the poor man's bread, but the poor man's bread is what brought us to the redemption. It's the 4 cups of redemption, but what brought us to the 4 cups of redemption? It's because of Pharaoh bathing in the blood of the Jewish people. In the Charot says, yes, it's the bricks, and it's the cement, which brought about that the Jewish people should decide, and they procreated with ease and without any pain. That means within every type of tragedy that exists within the Jewish people, there's a glimmer of hope. Not only that, the tragedy brings about the glimmer of hope, brings the light. The darkness is what brings the light. So in essence, what they were doing is what they were saying is that in these foods that we eat, we are, so to speak, backwardly thanking God for the pain. We are thanking God, like, take for example, a kernel of wheat. In order for it to grow, it has to rot in order for it to get a proper kernel, for it to germinate, for it to have a beautiful wheat. What we're actually saying, and in thanking God and saying that while we see this difficulty, it looks like an accident. It looks like all of a sudden everything is falling apart. I don't know what I'm going to do. How am I going to survive? But all of a sudden we look back a year later, 2 years later, and we begin to appreciate that that was not an accident. It was all purposeful. That all the reasons why we went through all that challenging times was to be able to get to that redemptive moment, to come to that redemptive part in our life. And then we go back and we thank God for those difficult times, because without those difficult times, we wouldn't have these special times. The Rebbe wasn't just a person who spoke about it, but he also experienced it. He lived it. The Rebbe was a person who, after the Holocaust, lost his entire family, lost thousands of Hasidim to communism, went through pain and suffering, saw at his table people that brought to him every single day their sorrows, their pain, their issues. He wasn't oblivious to what the pain that was going through, but he was able to see right through it, to see the light that came because of it. There was a fellow, his name was Gershon Ber Jacobson. His son, Rabbi Yossi Jacobson, tells the story. He was a journalist, and because he was a journalist, he had the ability to go to communist Russia, so to speak, free range, that they would let him, to a certain amount, go with his press pass. Because of that, he was a very good, useful tool, if you want to call it, for the Rebbe to send all tzitzis, talis, tefillin, mezuzahs, all items that need to get to Jews in communist Russia, and he would go report back and bring back to the Rebbe messages from the people there, and that was the form of communication. He was one of the many people who went undercover into communist Russia, bringing these things back and forth. He one time came back in 1971. Rabbi Jacobson tells the story that his father came back after a visit to Russia, and he came to the Rebbe to give a report. He came into the Rebbe's room. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and he was there for a good few hours, going through every single person. This mikveh was closed, this person was sent to Siberia, this person's family was arrested, going through every single thing. And in every one of the story, and every single thing of the anecdotes and stories that he was telling the Rebbe's face was serious. And the Rebbe's face was, you can feel and see the pain that the Rebbe was feeling for every single one of these families, for the tragedies they were going through. As the conversation continued, it was starting to get light outside. And as the night goes on, you can see the rays of the sun peeking through the blinds and the windows of the Rebbe's office. And as the conversation finishes, the Rebbe gets up from his seat, picks up the window shade, and the Rebbe says, "A new day is on the horizon. A new day is coming." What he saw and what he experienced is that with all the suffering that the Rebbe was talking about, with all the pain that the Rebbe was going through, he saw a new day coming. He did not allow himself to get fixated and sit in just the pain, but he saw the light. He saw the new day coming. Every single one of us, during the past 7 months, saw Jewish people going through the greatest amount of anti-Semitism ever since the Holocaust. We've seen that decisive hate that exists against the land of Israel, the Jewish people, in every shape or form, blatantly unabashed. Fully. What do we see? What is the Torah telling us? It is exactly in this night. It is during the night, during the time of suffering, during the time that it's the most painful, that we see a glimmer of light. We see the hope. We talk about the exodus of Egypt, because we know now in the month of Nisan is a month of miracles, that God will make the greatest miracle of all, the miracle of the coming of Mashiach. May be now. Amen.